Welcome back to Sleep Storyteller, where every night is a new adventure, and every story is a journey into the unknown. I'm so glad you're here, ready to relax, unwind, and let the gentle sound of rain guide you into a peaceful slumber. As we begin tonight's story, I invite you to close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let the world outside fade away. Remember, this is your space, a place to let go, to dream, and to find the calm you need. If you're ready for tonight's story, go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below sharing what helps you relax most at night. Now, let's begin. The last eclipse, the wind carried an unsettling chill as it swept through the vast, desolate plains. The sky above was a tapestry of swirling gray clouds, heavy and foreboding, as though nature itself was holding its breath. The sun, a faint smear of light behind the thickening clouds, was barely a shadow of its former self. In the distance, the jagged peaks of the mountains loomed like silent sentinels, their dark silhouettes cutting into the horizon. It was a place where time seemed to slow, where the very earth felt heavy with forgotten memories. At the edge of this vast emptiness stood a figure, a lone traveler, her cloak fluttering in the wind. Her name was Alara, and she had come to witness the end of the world. It was not a journey she had chosen lightly, nor one that she had ever expected to make. But fate had a way of pulling at her, guiding her down paths she never intended to walk. The prophecy had been clear, and its words had echoed in her mind for as long as she could remember. When the last eclipse comes, the world will fall into shadow, and only those who embrace the darkness will survive. The world had always been on the brink of something, teetering between light and dark, but this felt different. This felt like the end. Alara had been chosen, though she didn't fully understand why. She had spent years searching for answers, following every lead, chasing every fragment of the ancient texts that had been left behind by the ones who had gone before her. The ancestors had left her a map, a trail of symbols and signs that had led her here, to the very edge of existence. As the wind howled around her, Alara glanced down at the pendant around her neck. It was an ancient thing, worn and chipped by time, but its power was undeniable. The crystal embedded in it pulsed softly, its light flickering like a heartbeat. She could feel the weight of its energy in her chest, the magic that had long been dormant, now awakening with the coming storm. It had taken her years to find this place, and now that she was standing on the precipice, it felt as though the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for her to make the next move. The eclipse was near, she could feel it in her bones, in the very air around her. And when it came, everything would change. She had been warned about the dangers of the eclipse. It was said to be a time of great upheaval, a moment when the veil between worlds would thin, and the darkness that had long been sealed away would break free. But what the prophecy had failed to mention, what none of the ancient texts had revealed, was what would happen to those who sought to stop it. What would become of them once the eclipse began? Alara turned her gaze toward the horizon, where the sun was slowly being swallowed by the creeping shadows. The world felt suspended in that moment, caught between the fading light and the impending dark, as though everything was waiting for the inevitable to unfold. She was not the only one who had come to witness the eclipse. Behind her, in the shadows of the trees, another figure stood, watching, waiting. Alara's hand instinctively went to the hilt of the dagger at her side, her fingers brushing the cold metal. She didn't need to look to know who it was. She had sensed his presence long before she had seen him. He stepped forward, his dark cloak trailing behind him like a shadow. His face was hidden beneath a hood, but Alara could feel his eyes on her, piercing and cold. His name was Thorn, a former ally turned enemy, a man who had once shared her mission but who had betrayed her at the moment when she needed him most. Now, he was here. Drawn by the same prophecy, the same promise of power, Alara, he said, his voice low and smooth, like a whisper in the wind. I knew you would come. Alara didn't answer at first. She simply stood there, watching him, her grip tightening around the pendant. She had never trusted him, not fully. But she had no choice but to work with him, at least until their paths diverged. And now, with the eclipse on the horizon, she could feel the rift between them growing wider, the tension between them thicker than the air itself. What do you want, Thorn? Alara finally asked, her voice steady but laced with suspicion. He smiled, a faint, cold curve of his lips. I want the same thing you do. Alara. The power to change the world. The power to shape destiny. Alara's hand clenched into a fist. She had heard his words before, too many times, in too many different forms. Power. Control. The desire to bend the world to one's will. It was all a lie, a dangerous illusion that would lead to ruin. The prophecy wasn't about gaining power, it was about survival. And Alara was beginning to suspect that Thorn had never understood that difference. You'll never understand, she muttered under her breath, more to herself than to him. The eclipse isn't something to be controlled. It's something to survive. You can't wield it. Thorn took a step closer, his shadow falling over her. You're wrong, he said softly. It's not about survival anymore. It's about embracing the dark. The eclipse is the key, Alara. It's the only way we can break free of the chains that bind us. Alara shook her head, her gaze hardening. No. We can't let it happen. If the world falls into shadow, we'll all be consumed by it. You won't be able to control it, Thorn. He laughed, a low, dark sound that seemed to vibrate in the air. You're still so naive. The darkness is not our enemy, Alara. It's the truth of this world, the force that has always been there, waiting for us to accept it. She stepped back, her heart pounding in her chest. Thorn's words sent a ripple of unease through her. Could he really believe that? Could the darkness truly be the answer? No. Alara refused to believe it. The darkness was not a force to be embraced. It was a force to be stopped. She had to stop it. As the sun dipped lower, the shadows around them lengthened, stretching toward the horizon, drawn by the eclipse's power. The world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the inevitable. Alara turned her back on Thorn, her steps slow but deliberate. The eclipse is coming, she said, her voice a whisper carried on the wind. And when it does, we will see who the darkness truly belongs to. With that, she walked away from him, her heart heavy with the knowledge that this was only the beginning. The last eclipse was coming, and the world would never be the same again. The land stretched out before Alara in endless, barren waves. She had walked for hours, the weight of her thoughts pressing on her like a storm cloud, dark and foreboding. The sun was now a faint line along the horizon, swallowed by the oncoming eclipse. She could feel its pull, like a magnet drawing the world closer to its final reckoning. There was no escaping it, not now. The road had led her away from Thorn, whose voice still lingered in her mind. "Embrace the darkness," he had said. "The eclipse is the key." But Alara knew better. She had always known that the darkness Thorn spoke of was not a source of power, it was a force of destruction. It consumed everything in its path, leaving only ruin in its wake. And Thorn, blinded by his hunger for control, was about to make the gravest mistake of his life. The wind had died down, leaving an eerie stillness in its wake. Even the land seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. The eclipse was not merely an astronomical event, it was the culmination of something ancient, something powerful. Alara had read the old texts, deciphered the forgotten languages, and pieced together the prophecy from fragments of lost history. The eclipse was the key, but not the way Thorn imagined. As the sky darkened, the first shadow of the eclipse crept over the land, spreading slowly like ink spilling across parchment. Alara stopped in her tracks, her gaze fixed on the sky. The sun was no longer visible, its light snuffed out by the encroaching shadow. Only the pale light of the moon remained, casting a ghostly glow across the earth. In the distance, she could see the silhouette of an ancient temple, its crumbling stone walls jutting out from the ground like the bones of a forgotten giant. It had been a place of great power long ago, a sanctuary for those who sought to understand the forces that governed the universe. Now, it stood in ruin, its purpose lost to time. But Alara knew that it was no accident she had found it. The prophecy had led her here. She made her way toward the temple, her steps quickening with each passing moment. She could feel the air growing heavier, the tension building like a storm waiting to break. The eclipse was nearly upon them, and time was running out. As she approached the entrance of the temple, she felt a sudden surge of energy, a pulse that seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath her feet. She hesitated, her fingers brushing the pendant at her neck. The crystal within it hummed softly in response, as if acknowledging the energy that radiated from the temple. It was as though the very earth itself was alive, breathing in unison with the approaching eclipse. Alara stepped inside, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. The temple was vast, its walls lined with carvings and symbols, their meaning long forgotten. Dust covered everything, thick and heavy, as though the temple had been abandoned for centuries. And yet, there was a sense of something watching her, something waiting. In the center of the temple stood an altar, its surface cracked and worn by time. Atop it lay a single object, a stone, dark and smooth, shaped like a crescent moon. The air around it hummed with power, an energy so palpable that Alara could almost taste it. This was the source, the heart of the eclipse. The object that would either save or destroy the world. The moment she stepped closer to the altar, a voice echoed through the chamber, so sudden and sharp that Alara stumbled back, her hand instinctively reaching for the dagger at her side. "Alara." The voice was familiar, yet not. It was a whisper, a breath against her ear, but when she turned, there was no one there. She felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise, the air growing colder. "Alara, come closer," the voice urged again, and this time, Alara recognized it. It was the same voice that had called to her during her childhood, the voice that had guided her through dreams, through visions. The voice of the Ancient One, the entity that had shaped the world before time itself. Why have you come? The voice asked, its tone now full of ancient sorrow. Do you truly believe you can stop the eclipse? Elara swallowed hard, trying to steady her breathing. I have to stop it, she said firmly, her voice shaking despite her resolve. The darkness cannot be allowed to take over. The world will fall into ruin. The world is already in ruin, child, the voice replied softly, its words like the rustle of dry leaves. The eclipse is not the cause of destruction, it is the cure. The end of one cycle and the beginning of another. You cannot stop it. You were never meant to. Elara felt her chest tighten as a wave of doubt washed over her. She had spent so long believing she could prevent the eclipse, that it was a force of evil to be stopped at all costs. But now, standing in this ancient temple, facing the heart of the eclipse, she wondered if it had all been for nothing. Could the prophecy be true? Was there a truth she had failed to understand? The voice seemed to sense her confusion, its tone deepening, tinged with both sadness and understanding. The world is dying, Elara. You know this. The land withers, the skies darken. The eclipse is a natural cycle, a cleansing. But you are the one who has the power to guide it. You alone can decide how the darkness will unfold. The question is not whether you can stop it, but whether you are strong enough to embrace it. Elara shook her head, her heart pounding. The words felt like a weight pressing down on her, crushing her under their force. She had always believed that darkness was the enemy, that light was the only path forward. But now, in the face of this ancient wisdom, she wondered if there was another truth hidden in the shadows. I don't want this, she whispered, her voice cracking. I don't want to embrace the darkness. I just want to save everyone. I want the world to be whole again. The voice sighed, a sound like the wind whispering through the trees. You cannot save everyone, Elara. No one can. But you can shape the future. The eclipse is not an end, but a beginning. What you do now will decide which path the world will take. Elara's hands trembled as she reached for the crescent moon stone. She had no answers. No clear path. But the eclipse was coming, and there was no more time for doubt. She lifted the stone, feeling the power surge through her, like lightning coursing through her veins. The earth trembled beneath her feet, the very air alive with the power of the eclipse. The moment had arrived, and Elara knew that whatever decision she made, it would change everything. Elara stood frozen, the crescent moon stone clasped tightly in her hands. The very air around her seemed to hum with an otherworldly energy, vibrating beneath her skin, like the pulse of the earth itself. The stone, now glowing faintly with a deep, inner light, was no longer just an object. It had become a conduit to something far older, far more powerful than she had ever imagined. The voice, that deep, sorrowful whisper, echoed once more in her mind. You were never meant to stop the eclipse. You were meant to guide it. Her heart thundered in her chest as the words sank in. She had spent so long fighting the eclipse, trying to prevent its arrival, but now, standing in this ancient temple, holding the very source of its power, she wasn't sure what was real anymore. Was it possible that the eclipse wasn't the end she had always feared, but rather the beginning of something else? Something she couldn't yet understand. The temple around her groaned, as if it too were awakening, its stones shifting and creaking in the quiet. Empty space. The shadows lengthened as the moon's light filled the chamber, casting strange patterns across the walls, symbols she didn't recognize, but that somehow felt familiar, as if they had been waiting for her. Elara's mind raced, torn between her fear of what she was about to do and the strange pull of the stone in her hands. The prophecy had always seemed like a riddle, its meaning unclear. But now, standing on the brink of the eclipse, she could feel its truth resonating within her. The world was on the edge of a precipice, teetering between light and dark. And she was the one who would tip the scales, embrace it. The voice whispered again, urging her onward. You have the power to guide the eclipse, to shape the darkness, to choose the future. Elara took a shaky breath, the weight of the stone in her hands pressing heavily upon her heart. What if I fail? She thought, the question echoing in her mind. What if, by embracing this power, she doomed the world to the very darkness she had been trying to prevent? The ground beneath her feet shifted suddenly, and Elara staggered, feeling the earth tremble as though it were alive, as if the eclipse was already in motion, its shadow creeping over everything. The temple seemed to pulse with life, the very stones vibrating with the rhythm of the approaching event. And then, from the darkness beyond the temple's walls, she saw it, the first tendrils of shadow creeping across the sky. The eclipse had begun. A sudden, sharp cry broke through the silence. Elara's heart skipped a beat as she turned to see the figure standing in the doorway of the temple, his cloak billowing in the wind that had returned with a vengeance. Thorn. His presence, like a shadow of his own, filled the space, dark and commanding. You should not have come here, Elara, he said, his voice low and cold, filled with both malice and regret. He took a step forward, his eyes locked onto the stone in her hands. You don't know what you're holding. You don't understand its power. Elara tightened her grip on the crescent moon stone. I understand enough, she thought, the words ringing clear in her mind. She had spent so long running from the darkness, from everything that the eclipse represented, but now she could feel it, the pull of something far deeper than herself, something older than time itself. She was the keeper of this moment, and no one, not even Thorn, could take that from her. I'm not here to fight you, Thorn, she said, her voice steady despite the storm swirling within her. I'm here to stop the eclipse. To guide it, if I can. Thorn's lips curled into a smile, but there was no humor in it. Only bitterness. You think you can stop it? You think you can control it? He shook his head, taking another step closer. You don't know what you're dealing with, Elara. This isn't just about the world, it's about the fate of everything. The eclipse will consume you, just as it will consume everything else. You can't save the world by holding on to your hope. The darkness is inevitable. Elara's heart raced, the weight of his words pressing against her chest. But she refused to back down. She had come too far, endured too much, to give in now. No, she said, her voice rising in determination. I'm not afraid of the darkness. I'm afraid of what happens if we let it take over without understanding it. Without seeing it for what it truly is. The eclipse isn't a curse, Thorn. It's a transition. A rebirth. Thorn's eyes narrowed, his expression hardening. A rebirth? You think the world can be reborn from darkness? You're just like all the others who have failed before you. You're playing at something you don't fully understand. I understand more than you think, Elara said, her gaze fixed on the stone in her hands. The power within it surged, thrumming against her skin, urging her to take action. The eclipse doesn't have to be the end. It's just the beginning of a new world. But only if we let it be. The shadow above them deepened, stretching across the sky as the eclipse reached its peak. Elara could feel it, the pull of the darkness, its raw, untamed power, trying to break free. The very earth seemed to tremble under its weight. And the air grew thick, pressing down on her with a sense of urgency she couldn't ignore. Thorn watched her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. And then, with a flick of his wrist, he revealed the object he had hidden beneath his cloak, a dark, jagged crystal, pulsing with an ominous, blood-red light. The power within it seemed to hum, an echo of the very darkness Elara had been trying to understand. This is the true power, Thorn said, his voice cold and sharp. The eclipse can be controlled, Elara. It can be harnessed. And with it, I will reshape the world. You can either help me, or you can stand in my way. Elara's grip tightened around the crescent stone. No, she thought fiercely. She would not let him control the eclipse. The darkness was not meant to be wielded by anyone. It was meant to be embraced, to be understood, and only then could the world truly be reborn. She stepped forward, facing Thorn with all the strength she could muster, her heart steady and her mind clear. I won't help you, she said quietly. But I will stop you. The moment stretched on, as if time itself was waiting for the first move to be made. The eclipse reached its zenith, and for the briefest of moments, the world held its breath, suspended between light and shadow, life and death. Then, with a single, decisive motion, Elara raised the crescent moon stone high above her head. The air crackled with energy, the ground beneath her feet shaking with the force of the eclipse's power. And as she held the stone aloft, a brilliant beam of light shot from its surface, cutting through the darkness. The temple trembled, its walls groaning in protest as the forces of the eclipse collided in a clash of light and shadow. The power surged, a wave of energy that rippled through the land, splitting the very fabric of the world itself, and Elara knew that whatever came next, there would be no turning back. The beam of light from the crescent moon stone pierced through the thickening shadows, splitting the darkness like a blade through velvet. The light was pure, bright, and sharp, and it stretched outward, illuminating the temple in its intensity. Elara felt the energy surge through her, flooding her veins like wildfire, her breath caught in her throat. For a moment, she felt as though she were standing on the edge of something vast and unknowable, a precipice that threatened to swallow her whole. But she held her ground. Thorn's eyes widened in shock as the light washed over him, and for the briefest of moments, his crystal seemed to falter in his grip, its dark red glow flickering in the face of Elara's radiance. The world seemed to pause in that instant, as though the clash between light and darkness had frozen time itself. Elara, stop. Thorn's voice cracked. Desperate now, his composure slipping as the power of the eclipse pulsed around them. He staggered back, clutching his crystal tighter, his face contorting with frustration and fear. You don't know what you're doing. You're destroying everything. The temple shook, its walls groaning and cracking as though the very foundation of the world was buckling under the strain of the collision between the forces of light and shadow. Elara could feel the pulse of the stone in her hand, its power resonating with something deep within her. This was the moment of reckoning. The eclipse was not an external event, but something that resided within the hearts of those who faced it. She could feel the shadow's influence crawling under her skin, whispering to her, urging her to surrender, to give in to the darkness and let it consume everything. It was seductive, tempting her with promises of power, of control. Embrace it, it whispered. You are the key to the world's rebirth. Don't fight it. Let it be. But Elara shook her head, forcing the thoughts out of her mind. She had come too far, fought too hard to fall to this temptation now. The darkness was not the answer. Not in the way Thorn believed it to be. You're wrong, she said, her voice steady despite the chaos swirling around them. I'm not destroying anything. I'm guiding it. The eclipse isn't an end. It's a choice. A chance for something new. Thorn's gaze turned to fury. You think you can change everything? You think your little light will stop what's coming? It's already too late, Elara. The eclipse is inevitable. It's the end of the old world. It must be. And you. He paused, his eyes narrowing as he took in the glow of her stone. You're just a child, playing with forces far beyond your understanding. I understand enough, Elara said, her words quiet but firm. The light from the crescent stone flickered again, this time in rhythm with her heartbeat. The darkness is not something to fear. It's something to learn from. To understand. The world doesn't need to be consumed, it needs to be healed. For a moment, she thought Thorn would lash out, but instead, he held his ground, staring at her with an expression that was both bitter and resigned. You still don't see it, he muttered. The darkness isn't something you can heal, Elara. It's a wound that runs too deep. It's a force older than time itself, a force that devours everything in its path. You can't fix what's broken. Elara looked at him, her heart heavy with the weight of his words. There was truth in what he said, there was darkness in the world, in all of them, in the land itself. But there was also light. And she wasn't willing to let it go. The eclipse was not a choice between light or dark, she realized. It was a moment of transformation. A time when the two could coexist, when they could find balance within one another. To try to force one to conquer the other would be to destroy both. She wasn't going to stop the eclipse. She was going to let it unfold, but on her terms, not Thorn's. Her resolve hardened as she lifted the stone higher, the beam of light intensifying. The darkness around them shifted, as though it too was unsure of what to do. For a moment, it seemed to recoil, hesitant to face the power she was wielding. But then, just as quickly, it surged forward, a wave of shadow crashing against her like a tidal force. She staggered, the force of it pushing her back, and for a moment, the light faltered. Thorn's crystal flared brighter. The red light blinding in its intensity as it seemed to grow in strength, threatening to overwhelm her. "Elara, stop." Thorn shouted again, his voice ragged with desperation. "You don't know what you're doing. You'll bring ruin to everything." But Elara could hear only the steady pulse of the moonstone, the rhythm of the eclipse, the beat of a new world waiting to be born. With every passing moment, the power of the eclipse surged more violently, and the temple's walls seemed to shudder in response, the air thick with tension. The beam of light from the crescent stone flickered and then blazed with even greater intensity, cutting through the darkness like a knife through the night. Elara focused, pushing past the fear, the doubt, the warning voices in her head. She would not be intimidated. She would not let Thorn or the darkness dictate the fate of the world. "I'm not afraid of you, Thorn," Elara said quietly, her voice a whisper beneath the overwhelming force of the eclipse. "I'm not afraid of the darkness. I'm not afraid of what you think I can or can't do. I know what I'm meant to do. And I will do it." The power of the stone surged, its light blinding now, filling the temple with a brilliance that swallowed up the shadows. Elara's mind seemed to expand, as if the very nature of the eclipse was becoming clearer to her, revealing itself like an ancient secret. The eclipse was not just a force of darkness, it was the force that bound the world together, the balance between light and dark that had always existed, a cycle of life and death, growth and decay, and in that moment, Elara understood, she wasn't here to stop the eclipse. She was here to guide it, to restore the balance, and so, with a final, decisive movement, Elara pressed the stone against the altar, the light and dark converging in a brilliant explosion of energy. The ground beneath her feet trembled, and the air crackled with power, as the world itself seemed to hold its breath. The eclipse reached its peak, and the temple groaned, its ancient stones shifting under the weight of the forces at play. The darkness stretched out, but this time, it was not alone. The light of the crescent stone bathed the land in a soft, golden glow, pushing back the shadows, restoring the equilibrium that had been lost for so long. Elara closed her eyes, her heart pounding in her chest. The world was changing, but she could feel it. This was not the end. This was the beginning. The temple fell silent, the echoes of the battle between light and darkness lingering in the air. The ground beneath Elara's feet was still trembling, but now it was a low, steady vibration, like the pulse of a heart that had just been reignited. She opened her eyes, the blinding light of the crescent moon stone fading, leaving only a soft glow that bathed the temple in a gentle, golden hue. For a moment, there was nothing but stillness. The darkness that had once threatened to consume everything had receded, and in its place was a quiet peace. It felt as though the world itself had exhaled, releasing the tension that had built up over countless generations, but that peace was fragile, like the delicate balance of the eclipse itself. Elara could feel the weight of what she had done, and what was yet to come. The world had shifted, and now, it was up to her to see it through. Thorn stood in the shadowed doorway of the temple, his expression unreadable as he stared at her. His crystal still glowed, but its light was dimmed, flickering weakly in the aftermath of the eclipse. He didn't move, didn't speak, but his presence was like a dark cloud hovering over her, a reminder of the forces she had just faced. "Elara." Thorn's voice was low, almost hesitant, as though he were trying to grasp the meaning of what had just transpired. What have you done? This wasn't supposed to happen." Elara didn't answer immediately. She was still processing the enormity of the moment, still feeling the aftershocks of the energy that had surged through her, the power of the eclipse that had resonated deep within her. The stone in her hands was warm now, its glow softer, calmer. It had fulfilled its purpose. But its task was far from over. She turned slowly toward Thorn, her gaze steady. "I've done what was necessary," she said, her voice firm yet soft. "I've guided the eclipse, not stopped it." There was no stopping it, Thorn. It was never about stopping the darkness, it was about understanding it. The eclipse is a part of the world. It's a cycle, a force of nature. You can't fight that. Thorn's lips curled into a bitter smile, though there was no warmth in it. "You think you understand the eclipse? You think you can control it?" His eyes narrowed. "You don't realize what you've unleashed, Elara. The world. It's not the same anymore. The balance you sought, it's fragile. The darkness hasn't gone. It's waiting." "I'm not trying to control it," Elara replied quietly. "I'm trying to bring balance. The eclipse wasn't meant to be feared or destroyed. It's part of the natural order." Thorn's eyes flicked to the stone in her hands, his expression shifting. "You have no idea what you're holding, do you? That stone is not just a symbol of the eclipse, it's the key to its true power. And now you've awakened it." Elara's heart skipped a beat. The weight of his words settled heavily on her shoulders. She had known the stone was important, but she hadn't realized the full extent of its significance. "Then what do you think is going to happen now?" she asked, her voice low, a mixture of caution and curiosity. "The eclipse is over. The world is still here. It hasn't crumbled under the weight of the darkness, as you said it would." Thorn's expression darkened, and for the first time, a flicker of fear crossed his face. "The eclipse isn't over, Elara. It's only just begun." The words sent a chill through her. "What do you mean?" "The eclipse is not a singular event," Thorn said, his voice strained. "It is a cycle. A recurring force that shapes the fate of the world. And the moment you activated that stone, you didn't just stop it, you invited it to return. The power of the eclipse is bound to the world now, and it will not rest until it has claimed what it was meant to. The darkness is still out there, waiting for the right moment to reclaim everything." Elara's chest tightened. She had thought she was bringing balance, but had she really just set in motion something far worse than what she had intended? She looked at the crescent moon stone in her hands, its glow faint but steady. "But I thought..." she began, but her voice faltered. She had believed that by guiding the eclipse, she could bring a new beginning, that the darkness would no longer be something to fear but something to embrace, to learn from. Was it all just an illusion? Thorn stepped forward, his gaze fixed on her. "You were right about one thing," he said softly. "The eclipse is part of the world's cycle. But you were wrong to think it could be controlled. It's never been about balance, Elara. It's about domination. The eclipse comes, and it consumes everything in its path. The light you saw was a brief flicker. The true darkness is still to come." Elara's mind raced, the weight of his words settling over her like a shadow. What had she done? Had she made a mistake so grave that the world could never recover? Was Thorn right? Had she unwittingly unleashed a force she couldn't control, something even she couldn't hope to stop? The air around them thickened, and Alara felt a shift in the atmosphere, as though the very world was holding its breath, waiting for the next move to be made. The power of the eclipse, still lingering in the temple, seemed to surge once more, like a deep, rumbling growl from the earth itself. Thorn raised his hand, and the dark crystal in his grip pulsed again, its red light flickering like a warning. "The darkness is coming, Alara," he said, his voice low and almost mournful. "And when it does, no stone or light will save you." Alara took a step back, the weight of her choices pressing down on her. She didn't know what to do, didn't know how to undo the consequences of what she had set in motion. But one thing was certain, the eclipse wasn't finished. The true test had only just begun, the storm outside had intensified, and Alara could hear the howling winds swirling around the temple. The world was changing. And in the distance, she could see the first flickers of shadow creeping across the sky once again. It was far from over.